Look at this map from Soviet Russia. Somewhere past the Urals there's a gap. Not a lake, not a mountain, just a gap. No roads leading in, no dot marking a town, no name printed anywhere near it. But right here, in this blank space, over 100,000 people were living their whole lives. Full apartment blocks, schools, parks, grocery stores, a city humming along, completely invisible to the rest of the world, and even its own country. It was a paradise, but also a place that didn't officially exist. They called it Ozersk. Before that, Chelyabinsk 40. Before that, just a code on a construction order. And in 1957, something happened that the rest of the world wouldn't find out about until 30 years later. This is about how a government erased an entire city from reality and why people inside of it never wanted to be found. Let's go back to August 1945. The bombs drop on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Stalin understands exactly what that means. The Soviet Union has just become weaker overnight. He hands the problem to Lavrenti Beria, head of the secret police, and he gives him just one order: build a Soviet bomb and build it fast. Here's what decides everything past this point. Various scientists could enrich uranium, or they could produce plutonium. They choose plutonium. It's a denser path and technically harder, but it scales faster once the reactors start running. That single choice determines where the city gets built, how it gets built, and what almost destroys it 12 years later. To build it, the Soviets pull almost 40,000 people out of labour camps. They give them an offer. That's not really an offer. Either spend 25 years in a Siberian labour camp, or 5 years building nuclear reactors underground. They chose the latter, and they built fast. The first one went from an empty forest to an operational site in just 18 months. Compare that to the Americans, who took years to build theirs. The Soviets didn't have the luxury of time though, so corners got cut, workers were handling radioactive material with no or very little protective gear, and no real understanding of what it does to the human body over time. The same urgency that got the reactor built in record time is the same urgency that skips the boring and unglamorous stuff, like making sure the cooling system on a waste tank never fails. Nobody's thinking about that in 1946. They're thinking about the bomb. Right, so once the city existed, the next problem is making sure it didn't. No name on any Soviet map. No line on any national census. If you wrote a letter to someone that lived in that city, it got sent to a post office to a town hundreds of miles away. It disappeared into a system that officially didn't connect to anything. It wasn't just hidden. The state didn't just hide it on a map. They built an entire different reality for the people within that city. Picture a cage with better food than anything outside. Fresh bread every day, warm blankets, no shortages, luxury. But it's still a cage. Give it a few years, most people stop counting the bars, they start counting the bread and the luxury. That's what Ozersk was. Whilst the rest of the Soviet Union stood in bread lines for hours fighting famine, Ozersk had grocery stores stacked with caviar, bread, bananas, condensed milk, meat that wasn't rationed. Families lived in private apartments rather than cramped into a shared room between 3 generations. Kids got real schools, good playgrounds, real doctors that had real medicine to cure them. To anyone visiting from Moscow, this place looked like a rumour. Like a dream. And the trade underneath all of it was simple. You get comfort and protection, and in exchange, you give up your name, your freedom to leave, and your right to tell anyone where you are. Would you do it? The state didn't just give people a luxury, it gave people a story to make that luxury make sense. Residents weren't told they're prisoners. They were told they're the nuclear shield for the Soviet Union, the saviors of the world. The very few chosen specifically and trusted with the nation's secret. Try telling someone they're a prisoner when they believe they're a hero. For the first 8 years, that cage was literal. No leaving the city, no mail in or out. No contact with parents, siblings, or anyone back from home. Families from outside of Ozersk had no idea if their son or daughter was still alive, dead, or just gone. Some of them filled missing persons reports about people that were eating and living lives of kings at the same time. Eventually, the legal restrictions loosened. People could technically apply to leave. Almost nobody did. Here's why that matters. By the time the rules eased, a new kind of lock already replaced the old one. Leaving Ozersk didn't really mean walking out of a gate. It meant losing their apartment, the food, their salary, the schools, their hospital, all of it, permanently, with no path back. So the fence became irrelevant, because the alternative to this was going back fighting for survival. People were staying because the alternative just wasn't attractive enough. And through all of it, people who ate well and slept well and told themselves they're the saviours of the world, almost none of them knew exactly what was happening a few miles down the road at the Mayak plant. They didn't know what was in the waste tanks buried outside of the reactors. They didn't know how those tanks were built, and they definitely didn't know what happens to a tank when the cooling system isn't checked for too long. That trade, comfort for silence, only makes sense if you understand the ground you're standing on. So here's what's actually under it. September 29th, 1957. Underground at the Mayak plant. A storage tank holding high-level nuclear waste has a cooling system failure, and it goes unrepaired. Nobody's watching it closely enough to even notice. The liquid inside starts drying out. The temperature keeps climbing, and the tank eventually does what nobody has accounted for. It detonates. The blast hits with the power equivalent of around 70 to 100 tons of TNT. It rips a 160-ton concrete lid straight off like it was nothing. Around 20 million curies of radioactive material go up with it, spreading over what would later be known as the East Ural radioactive trace. Over 11,000 people get evacuated from 20 villages. Homes get bulldozed. Livestock gets slaughtered and buried. Farmland gets ploughed under and left to sit, and nobody tells the people why. Villagers just watch soldiers roll up and destroy everything they own. The story bare-handed is a boiler explosion, some kind of coal accident, nothing more. They get handed rags and mops to clean up. No protective gear, and definitely no warning about what they're cleaning up. The lid stays sealed for 32 years. The CIA already knows about this by the 1960s from spy photos and says nothing, because admitting a Soviet nuclear disaster means questions about the American nuclear projects. The West doesn't get a real account of what happened until 1976. The Soviets officially don't admit to it until 1989, under Gorbachev, decades after the fact. Now, put this next to Chernobyl. Kishtin released roughly half the radioactivity that Chernobyl did, and Chernobyl's cleanup and evacuation effort was massively bigger. And yet Kishtin still ranks as the third worst nuclear disaster in the world, behind only Chernobyl and ahead of Fukushima. Sit with that for a second. One of the worst nuclear disasters in human history. Outside of a couple of people, nobody on planet Earth knew about it. And here's what's stranger, not just nobody knew about it in 1957. Most people still don't know about this. Say the word Chernobyl to anyone that's somewhat well read, and they'll shake their head and tell you some facts. They've heard of it, they might know the year, or they've definitely watched the show. Say Kishtim and you'll get a blank stare. That was 1957, but what the disaster left has stayed forever. Ozersk still stands today, still closed, still fenced, still radiation in the nearby lakes, reading multiple times of what Chernobyl left behind. Most residents know all of this. They still won't leave. Most of what the state built wasn't about comfort, it was for control. And Ozersk wasn't unique. The Soviets built dozens of closed cities, each erased for its own special reason. The USSR collapsed over 30 years ago, but the file still says restricted. If you enjoy learning, let's bully your algorithm to teach you, and I will see you in the next one.